Hi, as Matt indicated, I'm Liz. I'm part of the teaching team here at Elm City Vineyard. And before I sort of get into the thick of things as we look at the lives of Abraham and Sarah and waiting well, I want to tell you a little bit about my week. So this week, I was able to sneak a visit into some friends who live up in Saranac Lake, up in the Adirondacks, which is exactly the place you want to go before a nor'easter hits. You want to head further north into the mountains. And I was up there because I was visiting a school in the relative neighborhood of Saranac Lake, give or take a couple hours. And as I was doing my job visiting boarding schools across the Northeast as a youth minister. So the family that I was visiting is a family of 6. They are a fairly large and boisterous family. They have 4 kids, ages 10, 8, 5, and 4. So stillness in their home doesn't exist. It's not a reality. The visit was pretty action-packed with more time with Thomas the Train and long division homework than I had really counted on. And then add into that the revelry of Valentine's Day and then a snow day, and you have some pretty crazy small ones on your hands. Now, Ruby is the oldest of the family, and Ruby was kind enough to give me her room for the few days that I was visiting, so she bunked up with her younger sister, Olive, who's 5 and a handful, and Ruby gave me her room. And for the few nights that I was staying in Ruby's room, what I noticed is that she, again, is 10 years old, and she's thick in the stage where she's just drawing things all the time. There's lots of ponies and girls with ponytails and things like that. And each drawing that she has a little sort of, encouragement on the bottom, which is adorable. And these are all over her room. And so this is one that she had tucked into a mirror that's right next to her bed. And if you can't read it, it says at the bottom, anything is possible, you just have to know it in your heart. I love her little hooks on the letters and everything. She's adorable. Anything is possible, you just have to know it in your heart. Now, every night before going to sleep, I would see this drawing of Ruby's, and I would find myself thinking immediately, oh, isn't that cute? She's still young enough to believe that anything is possible. Without skipping a beat, it was just instinctive in me. Oh, isn't that cute that you still believe this, sweet Ruby? I wonder when you grow out of that. And then almost seemingly simultaneously, because this is stuck in a mirror, I would catch my own eye, see the cynicism in my own face, and just be gutted and floored by how gross my reflection was. Just how disgusting it felt to be confronted with the depth of my own skepticism, of my world weariness, of my suspicion and pessimism, and of my own disbelief. I got all of this every night out of a drawing from a 10-year-old. But this is exactly the sort of thing that we're going to be looking at, and frankly have been looking at as we've engaged with the lives of Abraham and Sarah over the course of this series, as we've looked at what it means to wait well. And we're looking at the lives of Abraham and Sarah, who, as we looked at in the first talk, are sort of Hall of Famers of the faith. These are sort of the champions, the pioneers. But if you go back and either listen to the talks or, in your free time, care to take a gander at Genesis, the ancient book that we've been working through, we'll see that the stories of Abraham and Sarah are actually more accounts of their disbelief than really of their belief, which for me is a little bit of a relief. That though they continue to have experiences of God where He demonstrates His faithfulness to them, the powerful promise of God to create a great nation from a childless elderly couple becomes too big for them to receive. And so as we enter back in the story of Abraham and Sarah, where they seem to become accustomed to their barrenness, to their hopelessness, to the lack of God's promise fulfilled after a lifetime of waiting. We see that in the two passages we'll be reading today, that God reveals himself in his character and in his promise, that God reveals Sarah, just the deep brokenness and woundedness in her own heart, and that God further reveals that the promise is for Abraham and for Sarah, and that the promise is also for us. And so before I get into that, I'm going to pause to pray. So Jesus, we just thank you for this opportunity to meet in your name. Holy Spirit, please be with us. Please fill me with your truth and with your wisdom. God, would you open our hearts to meet with you and be changed by you today? Amen. So this is in Genesis 18. The Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre, and as he sat at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day, he looked up and saw 3 men standing near him. When he saw them, he ran from the great tent entrance to meet them and bowed down to the ground. He said, "My Lord, if I find favor with you, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought and wash your feet and rest yourselves under the tree. Let me bring a little bread that you might refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant." So they said, "Do as you have said." And Abraham hastened into the tent to Sarah and said, "Make ready quickly 3 measures of choice flour, knead it, and make cakes." Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to the servant, who hastened to prepare it. Then he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree while they ate. And they said to him, "Where is your wife Sarah?" And he said, "There, in the tent." Then one said, "I will surely return to you in due season, and your wife Sarah shall have a son." And Sarah was listening at the tent entrance behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age. It had ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "After I have grown old and my husband is old, shall I have pleasure?" The Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old?' Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? At the set time I will return to you, but in due season Sarah shall have a son." But Sarah denied, saying, "I did not laugh," for she was afraid. But he said, "Oh, yes, you did laugh." I love the Bible. It's just bizarre. Like, this is a bizarre occurrence. This 90-year-old woman laughs at God, denies it, says, "I do not laugh," and you sort of hear the smirk in God's voice. Yes, you did. Yes, you did. We're going to get to that. God promised Abraham and Sarah that through them he was planning on making a nation of people that would outnumber the stars. But to help birth a people, first they would need to birth a child, a single child, an heir. And this impossible promise from God began when Abraham was 75. And when we catch up with Abraham and Sarah in this part of their story, Abraham is pushing 100 and Sarah is in her 90s. The promise from God was stated 25 years ago at this point. And to our ancient friends, the promise of God seems right now like a lot of talk and no action. 25 years is a long time to wait. This is where the Lord meets Abraham and Sarah. He meets them in their desert, in their barrenness, and he reveals himself as the God who sees their desolation and sees their weariness. The ancient account in the book of Genesis tells us that these three strangers show up outside of Abraham's tent in the middle of the day. And like any good Bedouin, Abraham shows the travelers hospitality. He's trying to make them feel at home. It would have been an honor for him to do this. When he offers water to wash their feet, shade, and a little lunch, Abraham doesn't seem to know who he's invited over to his tent. He doesn't seem to know that it's the Lord at this point, because it's a very different vision of God than he's had previously. If we look back into Genesis 15, which we won't do here, but again, in your free time reading Genesis, please go ahead. We will see that God appears to Abraham with quite a bit more of pomp and circumstance. That it's very formal, it's very elaborate. In this case, God walks up to Abraham's tent, appearing as a weary man who needs some shade from the heat of the day, some water to clean his dirty feet, and some food to feed his empty stomach. But the way that God appears here isn't the only difference between this account and others. This is an interaction of God with Sarah, not so much with Abraham. God is interacting with Sarah to remind her that the promise that God made to Abraham is a promise for her as well. It's once the travelers make sure that Sarah is in earshot, we have this then cueing us that like, oh, now we're starting the business of our time here. It's once they know that Sarah can hear them that we see that Sarah is the primary recipient of this visit, that they restate the promise once they know that she's just behind the wall of the tent. Though most of the conversation that God has is directed to her through Abraham, God is visiting her not to give more information about the promise, but to give her a personal experience of a God who knows her and sees her and cares for her. She needs a personal experience of God himself so that she can know that the promise is real, that she can still place hope in it. Because she's heard all of this information before about what God plans to do, but she hasn't seen anything done. She knows about the promise for a child, and she even knows about, presumably, the experiences that Abraham has had with God. But this has all been secondhand. It hasn't been directed to her personally. And so in order for Sarah to wait well into the promises of God, into what he has for her, into the impossible, it seems that she has to know God personally, and that this is what he is here to do. That again, she needs to know that he is good, that he cares about her, that he sees her desolation, that he sees her brokenness. She needs to know the reality of the promise that's at hand. And so, God is here to reveal himself to Sarah. And God is here today to reveal himself to us. And this sort of interaction that we have, why is it important that Sarah has this firsthand experience? I was thinking it would be sort of like if every night I came home and I was really hoping that my roommates would become like really good friends with my friend Jen. And so the way that I went around that would be to, go home and tell all the wonderful things that Jen did that day, perhaps what she ate at lunch or a funny joke that she told, those sorts of things. That if I came home every day and just told these stories about a friend, that then that relationship that I had with one friend would translate to my roommates. But the thing is that in that scenario, my roommates haven't had time with Jen. They don't know her character. They don't know the way that she operates. They haven't spent any time personally with her to build a friendship themselves. So what we see happens to Sarah's heart is that she's been waiting for 25 years without a relationship to God, without this experience in the same way that Abraham has had. That she's hurt and that she is untrusting. that the reservoir of hope, of potential, of change that she has stored up has dried up at some point in the course of this time. And that God is here trying to get her attention. She's here to get her attention through Abraham. And it's not that Sarah has become too hard for God to make this grand gesture, that God approaches Sarah in this way, I think actually because Sarah has become too fragile, that she's so deeply hurt, that this is the only way that the God of the universe can say, hey, I see you, and I know you, and I know where you've been and where you hurt. And I don't think that this is an experience that we are all that unfamiliar with. That as we wait for the good things that God has for us, for relationship, for redemption, for reconciliation, for renewal, for love and for peace and for hope and for freedom, as we wait for these things and more to come to bear in our own lives, our wait, more often than not, seems barren. It seems fruitless. It seems like a desert wasteland. And it often feels this way whether we are waiting with God or not. Now, this is something that in a very peculiar way I've had some experience with over the past year and a half. A year and a half ago, I was, as I say, skiing for Jesus. I was on a ski trip for work, and I took a tumble, and the tumble was quite bad, as it turns out. And I've had to go through a couple knee surgeries, and I'm still not yet in full operational behavior. I can't run yet. Going downstairs is a challenge. But at the time, I was like, this will be fine. I can do this. This won't be too bad. The extenuating circumstances of following the first surgery was that I had to move in with my father, away from many of you, all of you in fact, away from New Haven and into the home of my most complicated life relationship. And then had to go through a lot of pain and work to learn how to just stand or walk again. It was a very, and still is, sort of a very surreal experience. And sort of this optimism that I had, that this won't be too bad, this is something that I can do, that I just will work hard and get through this, that lasted for maybe a month. And then the reality of my situation and the prolonged length of probably 2 years, at least one more surgery, just the ways that we didn't know how all of this was going to play out started to set in. And I found that the handholds that I used to have for how to get through difficult things had kind of fallen away, that they didn't work in the same way. And in addition to this, I was going through some pretty serious pain in a daily capacity in order to get better. And I remember thinking oh, well, I'm, in so many words, a professional Christian. I've got all of the tools in my toolkit to sort of get through this. I know how to read my Bible, I know how to pray, and all these things. And it turns out that wasn't what I needed. That what I needed was actually to invite God into my circumstance, to be with me and near me as I underwent this trial. But of course, that's not where I wanted God to be. Because what I found was, as the process of my experience in this desert, my process of this fruitless and seemingly fruitless period of my life where getting my knee to bend was a matter of degrees a week, a single degree a week was a gain and a win. That what I found was that the question became, God, are you good? Not what are you doing and where are you, but clearly you are not doing anything. And so the way that I can sort of logically progress is that you are not good because you are not here and you are not fixing this. And I think this is exactly where Sarah is. After 25 years of waiting and banking on this promise that perhaps her life will change, that perhaps her status in her society will be different, and that she can share in the joy of having a child, that the question becomes, after hope and promise is dried up, is God even good? And that for me, I think similarly to Sarah, the trick is that it becomes too painful, too raw to invite God into those places where we most need him, where the hope is gone and we need it to be restored. That it's painful to invite God and say, yes, like I feel alone, and yes, I feel burdened. That waiting for the impossible promise, and even the possible ones that God might have for us, without knowing him personally, without experiencing him in a regular way, creates bitterness and resentment within us instead of deepening our longing to see the good things that he has in store for us. And I experienced this as well, that my reality of being in pain with no end in sight seemed more real to me than the good things that God could do. It seemed more real than a God who could heal. It seemed more real than a God who actually was in the process of healing deeper things within me that I was not aware of. And it seemed more possible, the pain that I was in seemed more real than a God who was good. So we need an experience of God that will change the way that we interact with a period of brokenness, with a period of barrenness and fruitlessness. Not through someone else's stories or someone else's experience of faith, though these things may help us. We need a personal experience with God to reveal his character so that we might know that he is good and that he loves us and that he lives up to his promises, though they may be 25 years in the making. So God reveals himself, and he does this to reveal Sarah, to reveal the brokenness that exists in her own heart. Now, laughter is an involuntary response. I don't know if you've ever thought about this. I tell a lot of jokes in my line of work. I would say about 30% of my job is stand-up comedy to make awkward youth feel a little less awkward. Now, laughter is an involuntary response. I don't know if you've had to fake a laugh when someone has told you a joke and they're looking for you to get engaged. And you're like, ha ha. You can't fake a laugh convincingly. It takes a lot of practice. I've tried. I'm not very good at it. It's something that our brain decides for us. And it reveals to us when we laugh. It gives us insight, an uncensored insight into our unconscious thoughts. Like we don't think that we're going to laugh. We just do it. It bubbles out of us as we emotionally engage with something or someone. And it's not just when we're happy or tickled or something like that that we laugh. There are lots of different occasions where we laugh. My boss, for one, seems to only laugh at inappropriate times when something serious is happening. But we laugh to sort of emotionally process something that we're experiencing. And in the process of revealing himself, God reveals the current state of Sarah's self-perception in the way that she's interacting with the promises of God. Sarah laughs, but it doesn't bubble out of her like a giggle. You can sort of feel it boil out of her with cynicism. This exchange that we have between Sarah and God at the end of this vignette is more like one that we'd expect to hear between a 5-year-old and their parent than a 90-year-old and the Lord of the universe. Right? Why did you laugh? Oh, no, I didn't. Yes, you did. Like you sort of hear the tongue-in-cheekness that God has with Sarah. That Sarah's laugh here is not one of joy or wonder or surprise. It has a sarcastic bite to it. She was promised a bright future, that she would be the matriarch of an important clan and an important people. And at this point in the story, this promise is unfulfilled. Sarah feels like she's been forgotten, that the promise that a child brought her in anticipation and planning and excitement is unfulfilled. That this is a promise that now mocks her. And that all of her life, it seems, has been anticlimactic. The promise of God unfulfilled. And we see this most clearly when she says that she's old, that she's grown old. And this isn't just a statement about her age, because in the Hebrew, it's actually far more devastating than that. She's saying that she's worn out, that she's useless, that she's used up and good for nothing. It's far more pejorative than just she is old. This is a statement of self-hatred. A statement that Sarah laughs to herself is one of self-loathing. And in a culture where a woman's value was based on how many children she bore, Sarah is making a claim about her worth. She feels irrelevant. She feels alone and washed up, and that she has little to no hope that her situation will change. She's become buried so deep, so entrenched in her barrenness, into her hopelessness, that she's lost any sense of wonder that with the God of the universe, anything is possible. And we are like Sarah. While we may not have experiences with the elements of Sarah's specific situation, with her disappointment, her resentment, and self-hatred, are probably things that we know a little bit about. That as we invest in years of training and education in pursuit of a craft or a career or a project, one that seems like it may never be realized, we begin to sort of chuckle to ourselves. Should we give up and cut our losses? Should we try something else entirely, because what we've been doing for so long just seems foolish now, that there's no hope that it will be realized? That as we look at our singleness, do we resent those who have the relationships that we long for? Or do we look at ourselves with a critical laugh and examine the ways that we are undesirable? That as we face other disappointments and other goals dashed, will we continue to deaden our feelings as we bitterly laugh that this is all that life has to offer, that this is the best that it can get, that we should just get used to this? But a wonderful thing happens when God responds to Sarah. Sarah laughs in the face of the Lord of the universe, and he responds not by sort of giving her like a cosmic flick off the planet, but he responds in gentleness. He addresses and exposes her cynical and bitter laugh. He doesn't let it go unseen. Moreover, he rephrases her comment about herself, but he removes all of the negative things that she says. He's just making a statement. Yes, you are old. But isn't this possible for God? He's reassuring her not just that the promise will be fulfilled, but that she herself will be restored. And he doesn't retract his promise or condemn her when she then lies about laughing. He knows that Sarah is so exhausted, so consumed by the burden of waiting, that she doesn't have the energy to play nice with God anymore. That her weakness, her doubts, her struggles, they're all showing. And she just doesn't really care. She doesn't have the energy to pretend. And God seemingly has been aware of all of these things in her. And he has come to meet with her to reveal the cynicism that has been like nesting and burrowing deep into her heart. That he's shown himself to Sarah so that she would know that he is good and that he cares for her. And that the promise isn't just fulfilling the promise of a child, the promise that she's been waiting for, but it goes much deeper than that. It goes into the restoration of her whole soul. That he is there to clean out and wipe out the wounds of cynicism and self-hatred so that he can make room for hope and for joy once again. And as I was thinking about this, starting last week, the image that came to mind is that of like a wheat field. Not as like happy as this one kind of looks, but a depressing wheat field just didn't seem right in a February afternoon. But a wheat field that no longer has any of the wheat berries there, that the season has long passed, but no one has come down to cut down the wheat, that it is dry and it is brittle, that there are weeds taking over the plot of land. And that really what it is a tinderbox. Like, it is a recipe for a forest fire. And I think that that is sort of the state of Sarah's heart. That it's just the promise of a good crop, the promise of a child, has just become a dead field for her. But what's funny, I think, about this, if there is anything funny, is that all it needs is one spark, just one match, just one flint, and that whole field will be leveled. And that everything dead, that everything that has wounded her, all of her cynicism, all of her bitterness, can be wiped out with one spark of hope, just one. And that it will ravage the field, that it will burst into flame, and that something new can be planted there. A field that will actually produce a good crop. And I think that this is what God has come to offer her. That she can engage with God and be renewed, but all she needs is this one spark of hope. This one thing that will tell her, okay, let's do this. Let's start again. And I think that God desperately wants to do the same thing for us. That he is aware of the places in her lives that are bone dry of hope and promise. That he knows the places where we have given up, where we have resigned ourselves to an identity of self-loathing or self-hatred, where we say to ourselves that we can be no better than we are at this moment, that we will always have to deal with this brokenness in our lives, whatever this brokenness might be for you, that our laughter turns cynical as we see where our story intersects with the story of Sarah. That we see that it is so easy to just kill our heart, to let the field die, than to hope that something will be different. And this, exactly this, shows us that the Lord of the universe wants to know us, that he wants to engage with us in that spot, not in the spot where the field is like lush and that where we're skipping around in the promise that God has for us. He knows that the wait is long for many of us. He knows that how we wait is not often pretty. And he's not expecting us every time to wait well. He knows our capacity. He knows our wounds. But he wants to engage with us in the places where we are waiting. And he's almost shouting to Sarah, and I think he shouts to us as well, know me, meet with me, so that you might know yourself, that we might know who we really are, that we might be freed of the things that carry us down, that lie to us about who we are and what we're capable of, that we might know freedom and healing from wounds that we've experienced previously in our lives, and that we would know the full capacity of what God has for us. That the Lord is saying, meet with me. Let me expose your cynicism so that I can heal it, so that I can put a seed of hope where there's only been barrenness. And so that we might know where we're truly headed, so that we might know the trajectory of the life that God has for us. Living into a promise is quite difficult when we've forgotten what the promise is. It doesn't give us any momentum forward. And so God needs to deal with us. He needs to meet with us. He needs to expose our cynicism so that we can move forward into the promise that he has for us. We need that spark of hope so that we can be transformed and healed. And after God reveals himself, after he reveals the bitterness in Sarah's heart, he also reveals the promise that he has for her and the promise that he has for us. And so quickly, I just want to return to my 10-year-old friend Ruby and her drawing. Anything is possible. Watching her and her siblings over the past couple days it was really fun. I don't know how much time each of you spends around children. Obviously, if you are a parent, a lot of your time is spent with children. But they're filled with this sense of awe and wonder where everything is like cool and awesome. Watching a kid watch a science show is way more interesting than the science show itself. I don't know if you've experienced this. But they're like, oh man, like, did you know that? That's so cool. I love this about children, that they have this awe, a childlike awe, about what is possible and what they can know and how they play a role in the things of the universe. The cynicism that we see in Sarah and that we see in ourselves is something that happens over the course of time. We see it happen over the course of 25 years. And it's the slow erosion of wonder. The slow erosion of wonder. And God addresses this with Sarah and with us kind of head on. He asks, is anything too wonderful for the Lord? God asked Sarah and Abraham this question. He's not making a unilateral statement, although he is revealing things about his character. But he's inviting Abraham and Sarah into knowledge of him. He's inviting them into a relationship with him. He's inviting Sarah and Abraham to shed cynicism and doubt and fear and to restore faith. All things that God is capable of doing. None of these things are Sarah and Abraham capable of doing on their own. The promise of God does not meet them in receptive hopefulness, but in resistant hopelessness. Is anything too wonderful for me? God asks. And he requires a decision, a response from Abraham and Sarah. And if their answer is yes, some things are too hard, too impossible, too wonderful for God, then they have yet to acknowledge that God is God. And while we don't see their response in this interaction, and it almost looks as though God doesn't give them time to respond, I would find it hard for them to respond anything other than like, yeah, some things sort of do seem outside of what you're capable of doing. If they answer yes, then some things are too wonderful for God. It means that they have determined to live in a closed universe where things are stable and static and hopeless. That their present reality must be their future reality as well, regardless of what was formerly promised. Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? And this is not a great picture, of the father and mother of faith. Not a good picture at all of them waiting even remotely well. And yet it is a profoundly human one. But thankfully, not everything depends on their answer. God is going to do what he wants to do regardless of their disbelief. He is aware at this time of how small their faith is. How small their faith is that they will have a son at all, that God's promise will be fulfilled. And he's aware of how desperately they need to be renewed. This text can't teach us that this is a story about praying more or having greater faith or doing the right religious practices in order to step into the promises of God. This is a story of a God who sees and cares for his people in the lonely and dry places of waiting, and one who fulfills his promises. Later in Genesis, the Lord fulfills his promise and says, the Lord dealt with Sarah as he had said. The Lord did for Sarah as he had promised. Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to his son, whom Sarah bore him. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Now Sarah said, God has brought laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. And she said, who would ever have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. Now we don't see what exactly happens to Sarah during the process of her pregnancy. But looking at her response to receiving her son, Isaac, it seems as though we're interacting with like a little bit of a different Sarah. Not just because she's no longer waiting for the promise of a son, but because God has brought her laughter. He's taken her previous laugh of shame and of cynicism, and he's transformed it into a laugh of joy and wonder. The God who sees her and loves her came into her life, overcame her bitterness, her disbelief, her hopelessness, and interacted to change her situation, to change the rule of the way that things should be into the way that he wants them to be. And we see that Sarah is changed because she's now laughing at herself. Who would have said? The desolation of waiting has revealed deeper things in her that God needed to heal and regenerate. She can laugh at herself because she's now experienced the wonder of a God who heals hearts. And we see that Sarah has changed because the laughter of other people doesn't seem to bother her anymore. The Hebrew here of laughter, that God has brought laughter for me and that everyone who hears will laugh with me, the Hebrew here is closer to everyone will laugh at me. The cute thing with kids, they're laughing at you, not with you. That Sarah no longer seems to mind. And of course people would laugh at her. She's a 90-year-old woman breastfeeding an infant. This is a ridiculous image. But she no longer needs their approval because she's experienced the wonder of a God who provides. And we see that Sarah has changed because she names her son Isaac, which means he laughs. Every time she thinks of her son or calls him by name, she will be reminded of her faithlessness. But because she's experienced the wonder of a God who accepts her, despite her failures, she has the freedom to do this without reliving sort of her lowest point every time she faces her son. That in fact, it's possible that every time she called her son's name, it was a call of gratitude, of reminder. And we see that Sarah has changed because she now can laugh at the world's standards. That the God who would choose her, an old and washed up lady, for his purposes seems foolish. And yet, this is a pattern that we see throughout biblical history and throughout our own lives as well. That God works through the foolish and through the weak so that he can shame those who call themselves wise and strong without him. Sarah has a new perspective on what is truly possible because she experienced the wonder of God who turns her weakness, who turns our weakness into strength. This story in Genesis is an account of 3 revelations, that of God to Sarah, of Sarah to herself, and the promise of God to his people. We learn here that he sees us as we wait, that he heals us as we wait, and that he has good things in store as we invite the power of his presence into our lives. And so as we move into a time of reflection, and I'm going to invite the worship team to come up at this point, I have a few things for us to consider. I'll give them a second. When did you last experience God's promise? And I don't just mean when was this something that you read about or you heard an encouraging story, but when was the last time that the love of God reached deep down into your gut and changed you? And perhaps you're someone in this room who said, I've actually never experienced that. That isn't something that I know anything about. Or perhaps that's something that just scares me to death. The invitation that I think God has for us is to reveal himself, that we can invite that sort of experience and say, God, I need that. I need to know you in this way. before I can set foot into the promises that you might have, before I can even try to wait well for what you have for me. I need to know you. Where are you experiencing hopelessness? Where in your life are you experiencing fruitlessness or brokenness? Invite God to set a spark. Invite God to be someone who clears all of the brush away, all of the dead things that are taking up the land where something good and fruitful can grow. Invite God to meet you in your hopelessness, to reveal your cynicism, and to set a spark of hope and of joy. And lastly, is anything too wonderful for the Lord? This is a question for us to engage with no matter where we are. Is there anything that we have said, no, that's too big for God to change, that's too deeply rooted in me or my family or my city or in the world for God to do? Is anything too wonderful? Where have we set limits and boundaries on what God is capable of doing? And God invites us, like he did with Abraham and Sarah, to respond to this question, is anything too wonderful? And dare to name those things to God as we engage with worship and meet with God in communion.